Welcome everybody to our special edition pre-Pesach Judaism 201. We're going to do insights into the Haggadah and Pesach. We rarely look at the Haggadah as a whole for good reason. There's so many juicy parts and individual pieces in it. There's the 4 questions and the 4 sons and the 15 steps. And the story of the rabbis in B'nai Barak and Dayenu, and there's so much juicy stuff in there to talk about that we rarely look at it as a whole, and what the structure of the entire thing is trying to tell us. So this big picture is the subject of our discussion today, and we're going to see a powerful message that relate to us as Jews. So let's just jump right in. I'm going to jump in the middle and then go back. Welcome, Gail. We just started. You really didn't miss anything. Other than I said we're going to talk about big picture instead of individual stuff. So we have the 4 questions, which are very important. We'll get to that again later. And the 4 questions are sort of answered by a short paragraph that are just 3 or 4 sentences. And it's the paragraph that starts with Avadim Hayinu, which means once we were slaves. And the last sentence of that paragraph is a very important one. I think the original source of that sentence, if I'm not mistaken, comes from the Rambam, where he says the more you tell the story of Pesach, the more praiseworthy it is. And indeed, for many, this sums up the entire evening. It's the point of the entire evening. Generation upon generation, the parents teach the next generation the essential story of the formation of the Jewish people. That we were slaves and we came out of Egypt forged as, or in the process of being forged as a nation by Hashem. In genealogy, I have learned that generations on average are about 30 years. Most people have children, most women have children, have their first child somewhere in their mid-20s, but, taking into account also the men and taking into account multiple children, the average generation is around 30 years. So that means, I just noticed this today, that we've been telling the story approximately 100 generations. If you go back 100 people, 100 generations up one of our genealogical lines, we would encounter somebody who to whom this actually experienced. So this is so important that we have the phrase Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim, which means Zecher can mean remember, but it can also mean mention. And we see the phrase Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim all over the place. We're commanded to mention it every day and every night. And that's one of the reasons given why we have the 3rd paragraph of the Shema, which talks about Yetzias Mitzrayim, so that we get to say it every day and every night. And also it's in Kiddush that we do every Friday night, Yetzias Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim. And it's even in one of the versions of the Aseret Dibros, the 10 Commandments. It starts off with I am Hashem, not I am Hashem who created the universe, but I am Hashem who took you out of Mitzrayim. But there's also another commandment that's very important that we need to do once a year, and that's Sipur Mitzrayim. Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim. We need to really get into it and tell over the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. The Mishnah itself says that, the Mishnah itself says that it's incumbent upon us to, quote, see ourselves as if we personally left Mitzrayim. So what does that mean? If I give a simple example, you'll all know exactly what we mean. We've all come out successfully out of difficult or scary situations at some point in our lives. Anything from surviving a rough medical situation to even momentary things like just missing a car accident, we all know what that means. I know I have some intense situations in my past, and some of them are, maybe as trivially minor as, just missing, getting hit by a car, this or that. Not that it's minor, but when I tell the story, it only lasts about 10 seconds, right? But when you tell that story, for me, I imagine for other people, I can actually feel something in the pit of my stomach. I don't think it's PTSD. I'm sure it's just adrenaline as I'm thinking through what happened. I get a little adrenaline. My stomach gets a little bit fluttery when I tell the story. And I think this is what it means for the commandment to see yourselves as if we personally left Mitzrayim. Now, after 100 generations, it's not so easy to do that. And in fact, a number of Mefarshim through the ages have suggested that this actually is the hardest mitzvah of the Seder. Not the morer, which can be difficult, especially if you're using horseradish. But to really see ourselves as if we did it. My understanding, there is I've read about it, I've never seen it, the Sephardi custom that at this time, we among the Sephardim, they take the matzahs and put on their shoulder, and they all do one circle around the table. And that's the whole idea of trying to reenact, trying to really feel Yetzias Mitzrayim. So how do we do this? Us non-Sephardi, us people who, it's been 100 generations since it happened. How do we keep it up? So we do things to arouse our children's curiosity, right? How many answers to questions are so that the children will ask. And indeed, our most important mission at the Seder is to get them engaged so we can tell over the story. And perhaps this is epitomized with the 4 questions, which we just described is answered or beginning to be answered by Avadim Hayinu, we used to be slaves. This getting into the story is probably why the Gemara says that even if you're making a Seder by yourself, you have to ask yourself the 4 questions. Great. So we ask 4 questions, and then we say Avadim Hayinu, and then we take what seems like a 10-paragraph detour, which, if you think about it, and as you're going through on the Seder, once I point it out, you'll notice it. The 10 paragraphs are mostly about halacha. So what's going on? So, and let's go through some of those paragraphs. So one of them, so we start with, right after the Avadim Hayinu, we do the 5 sages of Bnei Barak. And this obviously is intended to teach us 2 things. One is that even the greatest rabbis have the obligation to sit around and discuss what happened at Yetzias Mitzrayim. And 2, to buttress the point that we just mentioned from the Rambam, that the more we discuss, the more praiseworthy we are. I should mention, though, and I find this incredibly fascinating, the Tosefta, which was another work also authored by our sages, Chazal, the Tosefta also has a story of 5 great sages. Interestingly, they're slightly different sages, sitting around and discussing all night. But what they're discussing all night, that version of the story, is they're discussing the halachas of the Korban Pesach, which actually is the subject of a lot of tractate Pesachim, which we just finished in Daf Yomi. All the things you have to do about the Korban Pesach, and if you miss it, and Pesach Sheni, very interesting. So we have 2 versions of this Bnei Barak story. We have telling the story all night or discussing the halachas all night. Okay, so what's the next paragraph? The next paragraph starts with, I am like a man of 70 years, but I couldn't understand, da, 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 da. And again, it's a halachic discussion. It's the derivation of our requirement to mention Yetzias Mitzrayim in the evening. It's more halacha. And then we have the 4 sons. I'm going to get back to that. Very interesting. And after the 4 sons, we get right back into halacha, various interpretations of, you might think, mittechila, or v'yachal. You might think that the obligation starts on the 1st of Nisan, but really it's the 15th of Nisan, or that it might mean specifically day as opposed to evening, and another halachic discussion. And then we get to Magid. Magid's a big section in the middle where we darshan a whole bunch of pesukim about Yetzias Mitzrayim. But I want to talk about the word Magid. The word Magid and the word Haggada are related. One is obviously from the other. I'm not sure which came first. But I want to talk about the word. So Haggada and Magid obviously come from, the reason why that's important in Pesach is it comes from the direct commandment in the Torah, Haggadah lebincha, which is you should tell your child. Now, there are a lot of words in Hebrew that mean to say. The two most common ones are Amar, right? How many parshas start off with Vayomer, da 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 da. Or Davar, Dibor is another word for speaking. V'yidaber, a lot of parshas start off with V'yidaber, Hashem, Elamor, da da da. Or even in the Shema, we have a Bidi Barta Bam, which is you shall tell your children, which also means you should tell your children. But there's a difference. Obviously, we wouldn't have all these different words if they didn't have different shades of meaning. So the word Haggadah, one way to look at how to figure out a word or the importance of a word, one method that some of the Mefarshim use is they want to look at the first time the word was used in the Torah. So the first time the word from the verb, I don't know the infinitive, lehagid, is used in the Torah is actually right after the sin in Gan Eden of Adam and Chava. Right after the sin, Hashem says, this is in chapter 2, I think it's chapter 2, Hashem says, Mi higid lecha, who told you, and we know the rest of the pasuk, most of us know the rest of the pasuk, who told you that you were naked? Obviously, there was nobody else. Nobody told them. What Hashem was implying is that someone or something or something happened that taught something new to Adam and Chava. And that's what some of the experts in Jewish words seem to derive or attribute into the meaning of Hagid or lehagid is not just tell something, but tell something new. So the message right from the word Haggadah, the message is that it is incumbent upon ourselves not to tell the same story from one year to the next. It has to be something new. It has to be something fresh. Okay, so we start the story. We get to Magid, and we're starting the story. Mitechila of day Avodah Zarah, which means in the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. Now, hold on a second. Didn't we just start the story a couple of paragraphs ago when we said Avadim Hayinu, our ancestors were slaves? What's going on here? So I'm going to get back to that question later. It's a very interesting one, and I'm on a roll, and I don't want to interrupt myself. I want to interrupt myself with something else. So let's circle back to the four sons for a second. So we have the paragraph, I was like a 70-year-old man, a little halacha there. And then we have the four sons section, but there's a little four-sentence, four-phrase paragraph. It's sort of like a fourfold blessing, Baruch HaMakom. In fact, I can say, it's so short, I can say the whole thing. Baruch HaMakom, Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenatan Torah L'Amo Yisrael, Baruch Hu. So one can go on for an hour about that, such as, isn't it interesting that the four expressions of Baruch right there come right before the four sons, and there's a lot of commentary about how they relate to each of the four sons. But I want to focus on one of those brachas, the third one, which starts off with Baruch Shenatan Torah. Blessed is the one who gave the Torah. The rest of it is L'Amo Yisrael, to your people Israel. This clearly is a shout out to the Birchas HaTorah, right? Before, Baruch Atah Hashem Notein HaTorah. So what's that doing in the middle or right before the four questions, right before the four sons? I'll leave that question hanging for a second, right? That's the way a shiur works, right? You for the first 10 minutes you keep raising questions, and then you tie it all up together with a bow at the end. And I'm no different. I'm going to do that too. So, what's interesting about the four sons is the wise son wants to know all about the chukim and mishpatim. He wants to know halacha. And the answer that in the Haggadah, it says that we're supposed to answer him with the halachas of the Korban Pesach, and that we can't eat anything after the Afikomen. To the simple son who just says, Ma zeh, what's this? We tell him the story. And we have this sort of duality. We're telling our sons halachas, we're telling our sons the story. And so far, if you can catch the drift of what I've been doing so far, is that we have the story of Pesach to tell during the Haggadah. That's what Haggadah means. But there's all this halacha stuff in there. Another interesting thing is in the Talmud Yerushalmi. So the four sons come right from a Mishnah in the Talmud Bavli, and what he asks and what we're supposed to say. The Talmud Yerushalmi also has that, but they have different questions and different answers going to the different sons. And in fact, on this point, it says the opposite. The wise son wants to know the story, and the simple one is asking about the halacha. All right, so let's start to tie all these loose ends together. We know that Moshe never asks Paro merely, let my people go. He always phrased it as, let my people go so they may serve Hashem. And we know indeed that that's what happened, right? Shavuos was 50 days later, and we know that Pesach and Shavuos are connected through the counting of the Omer. The two holidays are sort of bookends with each other. The whole point being that simple freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. With a hat tip to Chris Christopherson, who wrote that phrase. And yes, everybody thinks Janis Joplin did, but she did a cover. Chris Christopherson wrote it and did it first. All right. So the point is that if all we have is freedom, then we're subject to other forces, such as our own desires, peer pressure, societal pressure, right? There's all these other forces. And so the idea is when we have Torah, that helps guide our choices. And in a sense, the idea is that when we have Torah, we're more free, because Torah counteracts these pressures. It relieves us from those pressures, and we're more free to act in an appropriate way. So I think that this key insight, that the Haggadah is giving us a message about freedom and halacha, the rules we live by, explain this split personality aspect. I'm going to use a highfalutin word here, the dialectics that are in the Haggadah. And there are a number of places in the Haggadah where dialectics appear. I think the two main ones are, at first we're slaves and then we're free. And then right before the four questions, we say, now we are slaves, next year may we be free. So are we free or not? The obvious answer is both. I mean, we're physically free in a way. We're not subjugated. We live in a society where Jews have had more freedoms than maybe any time in history, since we had our own country, right? Except for Israel, obviously. And yet we're not totally free, because we do have all these external pressures, societal pressures, conformity pressures. So there's a dialectic there. And I think that's also evident in matzah. We read that the matzah is both the bread of affliction, and also the matzah is an expression of freedom. So what we learn from all this is that serving Hashem, which is done by observing the Torah that we received at Har Sinai 50 days later, is inexorably tied to leaving Mitzrayim. This tension between the two primary ideas, physical and spiritual, is reflected all throughout the rabbinical literature. So I want to go back to one other loose end that I left. Earlier I mentioned that we seem to start the story, we have to tell the story, and it seems like we tell the story twice. And I mentioned both of them before. So in one place we seem to start the story and we say, Avadim Hayinu, our ancestors were slaves. And then later on, 10 paragraphs, maybe later, we begin the story again with Mitachila of De Avodah Zarah. At first, our ancestors were idol worshippers. So the Haggadah here is actually reflecting two different opinions. This is the subject of a famous debate in the Gemara between Rav and Shmuel. The rule from the Mishnah, for sure, what everybody agrees with, is that we have to start with Genus and end with Shevach. And those two words mean disgrace and praise. We need to start the story in disgrace and end with praising Hashem, right? When you come from a low place, then when you get to the high place, you have even more to celebrate. That's possibly the reason why we have that rule here. But which low place should we start? So Shmuel said, and they're both low places for sure. They're both disgraceful places, right? So either we were slaves or we were idol worshippers. What's the real debate going on? And I think with just a little bit of thought, we can think that Shmuel is focusing on the physical story of our redemption. We were slaves and then we became free. And Rav is focused on the spiritual redemption, which is that our ancestors were idol worshippers. And once we came out of Mitzrayim, within 50 days, we were receiving the Torah at Sinai. So as you go through the Haggadah Saturday night and Sunday night, these are two underlying messages to look for. The story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, which is really obvious, and the responsibilities that a Jew has, and I think that's reflected a bit more subtly, but it's reflected in the Haggadah throughout various halachic discussions. So as one last point, I would like to connect this to our current COVID situation. There are a couple of lessons here. First of all, the very fact that matzah can be looked at or is looked at in two different ways. So too with our slavery, so to speak, of the restrictions that we're all living through. We have the choice, just like with the matzah in a way, we have the choice to write our own story. Do we see this past year as a period of being oppressed, or did we use it, or before it ends, can we use it as an opportunity for growth? I know almost everybody I've spoken to has at the least, even not even intentionally, did a bunch of self-discovery. Of course, when you're alone, you have time to do that. Self-discovery, thinking about which things are more important and less important. As you think about the things that we miss, do we miss going to Disney World, or do we miss, in my case, seeing my granddaughter? So, and I think that's an important message because we see the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of this slavery. The COVID pandemic is, God willing, Bli Ayin Hara, is going to end this year and probably well before December. So what will we do with that freedom? I read a really interesting thing. Maybe folks who have studied US history know the phrase the Roaring 20s. The area of the what do they call them, the flappers, and the go-go 20s. The 20s were a big consumeristic period in US history. And I read over the past year, I guess there's an obvious connection I never thought of, is that immediately followed, or what immediately preceded that, was exactly what we're going through now, the great flu pandemic of 1918 and 1919. And then when it finally waned in 1920, we had the Roaring 20s. So I think it's sort of easy to predict that, among other things of how society is going to be like in the 2020s is, there's going to be lots of the entertainment industry is going to try to make up for lost time, and the travel industry is. So we're going to be subject to all those pressures. And for us, we can go wild trying to make up for all the lost fun we had, or as responsible Jews, we can remember what our mission in life is, whatever that mission is. Are we if we're going to be taking some plane trips, is it to visit our family or is it to go to the Bahamas? That's a simple, but you know what I mean. On a deeper level, to repeat the message of this entire shir, as we are becoming physically free, how are we to act on a spiritual level? Will we resist the temptation to jump headfirst into this new roaring 20s? So my bracha to all of you is that we are able to lifsach, pass over our personal mitzrayims, which include this pandemic situation, but also our other personal mitzrayims, and to use Torah to help each of us fulfill the unique mission that we have, and to maximize our potential, to benefit yourselves and your family and those around you and your community, and to improve your life and the life of others in making the world a better place for all of us. So, Chag Sameach. And